first of all, welcome everybody to, this is the third week. Yes, third week. It just seems like I said last time, the week goes by really fast. I know I assigned kind of a last minute homework assignment, but it was an opportunity that I think would be too cool to pass up. So I wanted to see if there was a show of hands of those who actually attended Earl's Town Hall today. Yay. Wow. I'm very impressed. I love it. I love it. And I've done this before in other classes, and it's not like this amazingly spur of the moment, but it's very relevant. I've had students attend city council meetings, and usually it's on a topic that we're already talking about and discussing in class. So I'm glad that you're able to attend. It was quite long. It was an hour and a half. So thank you for tuning in again for another 2 hours for tonight's class. But I think we're really lucky because we're going to have Earl next week, and having him just for us for at least an hour, he'll be here next week. We'll be able to answer those additional questions as a result of the town hall today. So it's kind of a special thing that we could do a back-to-back session with him. So I wanted to check in with you guys about the scavenger hunt game and also the homework assignment. The project. I did get some really great project ideas. I think I responded to all of them. We also have a couple more rolling in, and I know many of you are still, a couple of you are still waiting and making a decision, and I hope tonight's presentations and discussion can solidify what projects you want to choose from among your ideas. So Malsri has put together a really good spreadsheet with all your project ideas, and we'll just keep cataloging them as we come along. So that's the update on the project. In terms of the scavenger hunt, there were some good conversations at the end of class. However, I wanted to address some questions that somebody else had brought up, and one of it was to partner up with someone in class. And I don't know if you guys really know each other prior to this class, and I don't want to break any COVID rules of partnering up with another person. So I would leave it up to you, but most likely I would have to say that it would be a really hard thing since you're not already in each other's bubble, so to speak. So I would take that class as kind of an individual class. Scavenger hunt game as an individual. But one of the questions that came up during the week was whether or not we could do a hybrid of the two. So I gave an option of not just exploring neighborhoods in Portland, but also looking at other cities around the world. And I forgot who it was that emailed me, but I think it's a great idea where you could also do a hybrid and maybe do 2 cities and other districts in Portland. So we'll do that. The other thing is a Slack channel. So I created that Slack channel, and like I said, I wanted to make it as a means for you to communicate with each other. So I'm really glad that you're doing that. And many of you have also asked to join the Facebook page. So it has a good following over the years. It hasn't been as active, so really it's as active as the participants. So if you want to post things on that Facebook page, you're welcome to do so. So we are pretty close in time. Actually, does anybody have any questions before we start with tonight's presentations and introductions of our guests?
Yeah, I had a quick question. I know I kind of brought it up about the scavenger hunt and about like the 5 pictures a week maximum, but do you mean 5 pictures per column, like per area, like, or are we just not allowed to work ahead at all? Like if I go to like 3 neighborhoods in 1 week, am I only allowed to do, 5 pictures is what I'm saying? Or is it 5 pictures per neighborhood?
I'm not leaving it. Molly, you can also help me answer this question because we have put this together. I don't want to restrict it to 5 pictures per neighborhood. I think it could be 5 pictures of any neighborhood. But I also opened it up to saying that you can put pictures of any pictures that you've taken in 2020. So if you end up going out in one really wonderful weekend when the weather is nice, so we have limited weekends now, you can take those pictures and kind of save them for the following week. But you can only play and include 5 per week, but you can save them because I've already said that you can use photos from 2020. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
You want to add anything, Michael or Molly, to that?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. If you have more pictures with you, you can just keep them with you for later, and you can just keep on adding them as the weeks progress. So that's totally your call.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions regarding anything I brought up earlier at the beginning?
If we're adding pictures from other cities, do those also have to be taken in 2020?
Well, that's a good question, because not everybody got to travel in other cities in 2020.
Yeah, I'm sure you should be allowed to place older pictures because very few people have traveled, especially internationally. So, and also, Hamid has a question. It's about how do you actually place them. So it's a parent file that has been uploaded in the scavenger hunt, and what you have to do is you have to download it onto your own computer, and then whatever changes you want to make to the file have to be done on your individual PowerPoint. And when you think you're done for that week, you can re-upload it back into your individual folder. So that way the parent document. So that's how you're supposed to add pictures to the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Anybody have any more questions, or should we get on with our program tonight? We can also help you, Julie, if you have questions in figuring out how to load them. I know sometimes it's easy. It depends on how much time you spend on a computer and playing around with pictures. So I can help if you need help outside of class. So let me get going with our program. So I'm really happy to be able to bring 3 of my guest speakers back tonight. This is a repeat from last year, except that Art brought it to my attention that we're doing it in different marching orders. But I think maybe I did it on purpose. But we have Art Pearce with PBOT. He's a policy and planning and project group manager, a good friend of mine actually over the years. And we've worked together. I've learned so much from Art over the years in his position and what he's done for the city. So Art will be talking about PBOT and its initiatives. And after Art is Margi Bradway. I see Margi on the call as well. Margi has worked for ODOT at one point and also has worked at PBOT and now at Metro. And Margi is the Planning and Development Deputy Director at PBOT at Metro. And so she's going to share some of the work at a regional level and what we're planning for transportation and everything else, including transportation. So it's going to be pretty dynamic. And after Margi will be Bob Hasting. Bob works for TriMet. And I know it's going to be a very heavy class, but I feel like it's important to bring the 3 agencies together for one night in order to have this discussion about policy at regional and local levels, and also what we're planning on doing. So each will have 20 minutes to share what each agency are doing. And then after that, we'll go to a 10-minute break, and I'll bring them back all again in a panel Q&A discussion. And that should close out our class. So anything before we get started with Art? Anybody have any questions? No. Okay. Malsri, can you load up Art's presentation? And while that comes on, Art, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, this is fun to be part of this class again this year. I've presented on and off a number of different years, but I think my strongest association with this class is I actually was a student of this class in the late 90s. So as I was working for Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon and was considering various career paths, I attended this class as part of sort of the first entry into thinking about transportation and transportation planning. And looked at that point, my project was the Tillamook Bikeway, way back when we were developing our first greenways in the city. And so I volunteered for that. So it's really fun to be part of this ongoing community. And I think, I really want to emphasize how much the perspectives you bring and the interest that you're bringing is really valuable to the way that we govern transportation and improve transportation in Portland. And so I'm really glad that you're taking the time and interest to lean into this, and really encourage you to have some fun with your chosen projects and seeing how you might be able to manipulate government into your will through the process. It's a good exercise in understanding the various layers of bureaucracy that we are all working with on a daily basis. So I'm going to go through I've got a little bit of a wild ride for you here, so buckle up. I apologize. I intended to do some more editing than I did, but we're just going to power through. And also, I think I'll just kind of keep tagging you. So let's go next, and then we'll see if we can get in a good sync. I'll try to do like 20, 30 seconds a slide. So maybe go next slide if it will work. All right. So at PBOT, we have a strategic plan, which I believe you were assigned as homework, with three major goal areas: safety, moving people and goods, and asset management. And that pretty well summarizes the major offerings of the Bureau, but there's a lot of other ways in which we interact with the public. But those are the sort of primary entries into it. All right, next slide. What I think is evolving right now in this current time and over the last year was, I think I showed this in the PowerPoint last year as well, is how much transportation justice really as a combination of climate and equity and racial justice considerations is becoming more and more of the forefront of our considerations as we're deliberating our service offerings as a Bureau. And so we're really looking into how the policies we've been setting, the programs that we have deliberated on, and how we deliver the projects can both deliver a lower carbon footprint, but also a more just city for us to navigate. So next. So as we are looking through our activities, we have two key questions. One is, will this activity or program advance equity and address structural racism? Next. And will it reduce carbon emissions? So those are two pretty high measures to set to ourselves, but they are really, really, I think, refreshing lenses to place back on ourselves. And at least when we are compromising, we are knowing that we are compromising. So next slide. When many of you are familiar with the difference between equality and equity, but I liked this illustration of it because it's a very transportation centered one. But it really means that we're not trying to offer the same services to everyone. We are trying to offer the services that people need and address the difference in ability and ability to access services as well. So next slide. A lot of our work around racial equity is centered around the overall citywide racial equity strategy and goals that the Office of Equity and Human Rights is overseeing. And so we are, we're going to have this slideshow, so I won't read through this whole deck for you. But we do have these major goals around ending racial disparities within government, strengthening outreach and engagement, and deepening collaboration with institutions and communities to eliminate racial inequities in the ways that we govern and provide services. So next slide. For PBOT, we're really working at a deeper level in looking at the transportation justice policy framework, understanding what we mean by transportation justice as a bureau, working on clarifying the goals for the specific bureau, partnering with frontline communities, and then developing deeper processes that also pertain to Title VI and ADA in terms of meaningful access to transportation services. And then within the Bureau, we are in the process of a pretty radical culture shift away from equity work being the lunchtime committee that you participate in to being the meetings that you are working on and part of your specific work program as staff within the Bureau. And that's a change. That's an evolution in terms of our depth of commitment as a Bureau. And you'll be able to see this link down below and when you get the version of this, but it's worth a reading the message from our director this past June, where he's talking about his commitment and his direction for us as a Bureau to deliberately be anti-racist in our approach to delivering transportation services. Next slide. Disability rights is a key and really maybe more ongoing approach for the Bureau. So we have a whole set of ADA related programmatic approaches and offerings and federally required things such as the ADA curb ramp retrofits that we're doing citywide through the Creek settlement. Next slide. There's some really exciting short-term partnerships and upcoming partnerships that are really changing the way that our Bureau is connected with the community. Irene Marion, who I think maybe might be able to come join your class later on in the series, she mentioned to me today, and she gave me some of these slides to share with you, has done an amazing job leading these really transformative partnership approaches around frontline community partnerships, where we're directly funding partnership groups to help us work on some of our various programs, as well as creating a ongoing contractual relationship with community organizations, so staff that are working with community groups can bring some revenue to the process and enlist those community organizations in helping deliver the transportation efforts. All right, next slide. And why is this important? Well, it should be obvious, but I think it isn't enough, that we need to state it in a deliberate and outright way. Our streets are for all of Portland, or for all Portlanders. And that has not been the perceived understanding of how Portland streets have been understood and governed. And we need to expressively and deliberately counteract those forces. And so it's important for you to understand it as that way and to bring your voice to the conversations and make sure that government is responding to that. Next slide. It was not always this way. This is on the left there, or my left anyway. That is literally a clip from a postcard from Portland. Be careful crossing the streets in Portland. And you understand in the context of the types of improvements that were being proposed or delivered at that point. You see the people standing around checking out the proposed freeway. I think this was actually the Mount Hood freeway that they were standing next to, which wasn't built, or seeing the swath of land that was cleared and removed through North Portland, specifically doing harm and damage to the Black community in Portland in its process to benefit the white wealth that was needed faster mobility. Next slide. And there was a whole network that was proposed all throughout the city. So this is a literal map of what was planned for the freeway network for Portland that really would have changed the type of city we were in and really have not led to the sustainable outcomes that we're pursuing. Also, next slide. We're just going to start moving faster here. Here's, this is what Lloyd District looked like, starting to perpetuate these trends of the amount of parking we're going to need to build to sustain this 1950s era lifestyle. Next slide. This is an illustration of how many Big Pink's worth of parking garages we would need to build if we weren't to build the Max line out to Gresham back in the 80s. Next slide. And this is, in the 1970s, what the air was like in Portland. Of course, this slide has different meaning to us now with the recent wildfires, but it has real consequences to the livability of a community, how we design and conceive of our transportation system. Next slide. Fortunate for all of us, and Margi will talk more about this in a little bit, but there's a regional and statewide context for land use and transportation planning. And I'll let Margi go into more details, because I'm sure she has more on it there. But it sets a framework for us to understand that land and street resources are valuable and need to be considered deliberately. And it provides for us a real understanding that we have something precious rather than something that is sort of everlasting and ongoing, that we are consuming together and need to be governed very wisely. Next slide. Portland has a really deep history of also attendance to climate and carbon outcomes. In 1993, we were the first city to create a local carbon action plan, and that's been renewed and re-upped through a number of updates and then brought into the Portland Plan and Transportation System Plan. Next slide. And it's a very significant consequences. About 40% of our emissions in Multnomah County are a result of the transportation sector. So we have a major place to play in combating climate change, and the choices we make will have generational and many generational impact to come. Next slide. We have incredibly lofty goals. If you look at the actual trends shown here, and this one needs to be updated because it's from 2017, versus the trajectory of where we need to go to, of 80% by 2050 or net zero by 2050, we need to have a radical re-understanding of how we are dealing with moving people and goods. All right, next slide. We have on the right there is actually what's in our planning documents adopted, which is the transportation strategy for people movement, which is highlighting walking, cycling, and transit as our top priorities, then fleets of autonomous vehicles, other shared vehicles, and then our planners are being cute with this to give no love for the low occupancy vehicles. But we really think about this as conserving transportation resources just in the way that you think about conserving energy resources, through reducing your consumption and your demand on the system by attending to those smaller moves, the choice to walk to the store versus driving to the store, so that longer trips are able to be served. Next slide. We have very aggressive goal in terms of the reduction of of automobile trips, of drive alone trips, from 57% drive alone down to 30% drive alone. And so we continue to have a lot of work to do to change to the level that we need to meet the system needs as well as the climate needs. Next slide. We discussed this as a trip gap. We have, if absent our interventions, we will see another 500,000 vehicle trips by 2035. And so we need to reduce that pressure, bring it down through transportation projects, through programmatic interventions, through working with business to provide incentives and programs, and really think about how we can grow using the right-of-way more efficiently, moving away from inefficient uses where an individual takes a large amount of space for their mobility, to focus more on buses, cycling, and walking, which are much more efficient ways to move people through the space. Next slide. This is an illustration of the Portland centers that are there in white. With in blue, you see the various transportation projects. And so this is an illustration of how we're sort of focusing in on supporting our key places and offering more options through walking, cycling, and transit, all the while prioritizing equity. And you'll see a couple of these centers are highlighted in orange, which is highlighting that we need to put additional attention to retrofit those areas and bring up the level of transportation service. Next slide. Another way of looking at this, the Planning Bureau has done a heat map of neighborhood completeness. And so you'll see that the inner neighborhoods, the north neighborhoods, and downtown have a much more level of completeness. And this isn't just transportation services. This is also stores, grocery stores, those kind of things as well. But there's a lot of work to be done to bring that level of completeness that could allow somebody to live that lifestyle where they aren't as reliant on the automobile. Next slide. This is a actual screenshot of some data analysis we did as we were looking at how to prioritize transportation improvements. And this is the specific one for how we were prioritizing equity. So you'll see the projects that rated the highest are the ones in red, and those are the ones in East Portland based on their concurrence with populations, higher indice of seniors, people with disabilities, and people of color. Next slide. So this is a lot of the streets that we have in East Portland, still very open and undefined, relatively scary for a pedestrian or cyclist. Next slide. And this is the types of retrofits that you are seeing and have coming for a lot of those same really busy streets in East Portland, all attendant to our goal of Vision Zero, which I think maybe that slide got hidden. So the types of improvements we're doing: walking retrofits, making our streets more capable of carrying more people and providing more ease of movement. Next slide. Cycling improvements, so we were focused in on all ages and abilities, and then transit improvements, continuing to focus in on the need for a complete rail network, but then also in the near term, focusing a lot on bus mobility. If you go one more slide forward, including an initiative we've been working on the last couple of years that's now coined the Rose Lanes, where we're working on getting buses out of congestion and out of traffic, and there's a bunch more improvements that are happening this fall and into next summer based on our Portland's focus on trying to reallocate roadway space to prioritize transit. Next slide. Also focusing in on freight, Portland is just in the process of kicking off updating its 2040 freight plan. So a lot of focus on goods movement in the next couple of years for Portland and how that can be part of our sustainability strategy rather than a stress on that. Next slide. And continued understanding that automobile mobility is part of the package of mobility for the city. But wanting to push us to understand how that system can be operated more efficiently, how new technologies can come and help us understand how to use the system more effectively, shared vehicles such as Car2Go, which unfortunately left the city, and then also the knowing that there's still at some point self-driving cars coming our way. One more slide. And then, of course, we have all of this technological disruption that is coming to the city and continuing to want to make sure that we are emphasizing our values of creating a livable community when we're engaging with these various technology companies, which are trying to learn how to provide mobility and, of course, also make money in the process. And there's just so much here. There's almost a whole show's worth of conversation around this one slide. Next slide. I'm pretty much out of time, so I think what I'm going to do is not go into the safe streets, and we can talk about that during the Q&A if you'd like. But one of the recent initiatives relevant to COVID was focused in on, and maybe go one more slide forward and I'll stop there, was focused in on how we can use our streets more effectively. Yeah, that's the perfect slide. To adapt to the current situation we're in terms of COVID and social distancing, but bring us to a better future in the process. So we focused in on calming our neighborhood greenways and quiet streets, on supporting healthy business, outdoor plazas and dining and retail use, as well as retrofits on busy streets to provide better crossings. And those kind of items. And so happy to talk about more about that specific initiative in the Q&A.
Thank you, Art. Thank you. This is great. I didn't want to stop you.
No, it's okay. I don't mind. And if we want to go there, I can go there more in the end. But so there's
Okay.
maybe actually, you know, how about this? If you just click, just keep clicking and just show the images of the slow streets. You can do it in about 10 seconds. just slowly click through them. So this is the slow neighborhood streets, which you've seen the signs out for. Another example of that, calming down our greenways, whole network of those. We did in 20 locations total, or 200 locations total. So you'll see all the locations with red dots of where we have calmed those greenways. And we are seeing this as becoming a permanent program with more permanent materials and an opportunity for us to deploy anti-racist information and welcoming sort of imagery along our streets as part of the effort, which we're quite excited about. And similarly on busy streets, we're amending sidewalk area, adding crossings, those kind of elements. Keep going, just keep clicking away. There must be a lag. So we're focusing specifically on East Portland, addressing equity. And these are some examples of the types of improvements we did on East Portland and Montevilla. And then also healthy businesses. We've been focusing in on allowing businesses to use the right-of-way with the hope that that may reframe our understanding of the use of the right-of-way more generally.
A lot of work. A lot of good stuff.
It's been a lot of work, so I think that's good. We'll stop
a lot
there.
of good stuff. Okay,
Yep.
that's yeah. We can return back to the slides or to Art, and we'll hold him for the Q&A. But next up, I want to bring Margi on. Malsri, if you could bring up Margi's presentation, that would be great. Hi, Margi. So great to see you.
Hi, great to see you, and thanks for having me tonight. Again, I'm the Deputy Director of Metro, our Planning and Development Department. I'll give a little bit of history on what Metro is. I'll keep it short. A little bit of some of our successes and then some of our challenges. This is not my PowerPoint. This is TriMet's.
This is TriMet.
I'm sorry, I'll just get that one here.
Yeah, while I've got the floor, I just want to do a shout out to Quincy Brown. I don't know if his video is on, but he is on our core committee, which is our committee for equity and diversity. Hey, Quincy. And I just really appreciate his input. I will be talking about some of our equity work tonight that would not be possible without core and people like Quincy volunteering. So just want to shout out to Quincy. All right, this is my presentation.
Let's go view mode.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Next, so I think I introduced myself. So next slide. What is Metro? Metro is a conglomeration of different functions, regional functions. It includes a park system, your garbage and recycling, arts and events. We're struggling obviously right now. The Oregon Zoo, and then our department is planning and development. We do other functions, but this is what we're known for. We work with 26 different local and regional agencies, including ODOT and TriMet, but also 24 cities and counties. Next slide. Here's a picture of the Portland region. We currently serve in our MPO boundary 2.1 million. And our boundary includes all of Multnomah County, most of Washington County, and 2/3 of Clackamas County. So we do not go all the way out to Sandy, but we include the most urban and suburban parts of Clackamas County. Next slide. Why is working on transportation important from a regional standpoint? Well, travel is regional. If you look at this chart, we call this the octopus chart at work at the office. But basically what it tells a story is where people go when they commute. And it's shockingly like 59% of Clark County leave the county when they go to work. 64% of Clackamas County leaves the county to go to work. And even Washington County, that's that big blue line. So they have some coming in. A lot of this is going downtown. Now, of course, we're in COVID and things might change in the future, but travel patterns tend to be regional. Next slide. In terms of Metro Council desired outcomes for Greater Portland, this applies to transportation as well, but these are the outcomes that have been voted on by our Metro Council: equity, vibrant communities, safe and reliable transportation, economic prosperity, clean water and air, and then leadership on climate change. Next slide. The department that I work in is called the Planning and Development Department. We have regional coordination on policy planning and programs and investments that facilitate and enable regional systems. Land use is our foundation. We also play a federal role as what's called the MPO, or the Metropolitan Planning Organization, that oversees the federal funding for the region and transportation. More recently, Metro has grown to include both in housing, quite a large housing and economy portfolio, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But we like to say that we have both kind of carrots and sticks, or incentives and regulations, depending on which side of the coin you're on. The urban growth boundary was put in place in 1974. The Senate Bill 100 passed in 1974. That was the famous bill that established land use for the state of Oregon. And then our urban growth boundary was set in 1979. At the time it was set, the population in Portland area for the whole region was under 1 million. So we have doubled it since the 70s. And the goal of this was really to try to preserve our farm, parks, and our nature area. And I'm going to give you a few examples. Next slide. Next slide. There is a lag, all right? So here's a picture of Cornelius and Forest Grove. This is taken in the 2000s. So this is a good 30 years after the urban boundary has been put in, and the urban boundary is right there. It sticks out and grabs Forest Grove and comes back. And you can see what a big difference that has made in these cities in terms of creating density. And with density, therefore, you have shorter, more efficient transportation trips. Next slide. And so somewhat after, in the 90s, once the urban growth boundary was set and Metro, really a young organization, became established in the late 70s, in 1990, we developed, my predecessors developed, the 2040 growth concept. That was kind of the foundation for land use planning in the region. And you heard Art talk about the centers and the corridors in the city of Portland. The 2040 growth concept really introduced the concept of centers and corridors, meaning that the centers and neighborhood centers should hold all the economic activity and the density, and the corridor should act as places to travel in between and concentrate that growth. Next slide. We also, as part of our federal responsibilities, create the regional transportation plan. It's a massive amount of work that we bring all the cities and counties and parties together and say, what is our policies for the next 25 years? And we develop a project list. In 2018, the last RTP that I worked on, we had over 1,000 projects in the project list, and we evaluated them on our values of climate and safety, and refine those projects to best meet our goals. Next slide. We also have at Metro the Climate Smart Strategy. In 2014, we were the first MPO, not only in the state, but really leading in the nation with our colleagues in California in terms of integrating climate strategies with our regional transportation plan, and included everything from policy changes to partnerships, education, planning, and design. And then we came up with specific strategies. Next slide. And I'll say that the Climate Smart, while we're going to the next slide, was updated and integrated in the 2018 RTP. So some of the strategies, these are big buckets of strategies. There's more specific actions if you want to go into Climate Smart, but everything from transit to biking and walking, but also pricing strategies, funding strategies, the use of technology is very important, ITS and operational flow, as well as incentives, what's commonly called as TDM, or Transportation Demand Management. Next slide. We modeled all of the strategies and for effectiveness, and a lot of people are kind of shocked when they see biking and walking in the moderate reduction impact. And I want to clarify that, because really the important thing about the biking and walking investments that we found from our modeling was that it had to match the land use. So you can build a sidewalk in a rural area, but if no one uses it, it doesn't have the same impact. But if you can if you can build land use that creates short trips, then you'll maximize the biking and walking. Next slide. So we do a lot of work that in terms of providing grants, what we call our programs. We have several grants and programs to try to implement our climate smart strategies. We work with our partners, we provide technical expertise. And so for example, there's a lot of money that flows from Metro to PBOT, and then PBOT would implement, say, the regional flex fund allocation bike ped projects. So I'm not going to read through this list, but this gives you an idea of the type of work we do. Next slide. We also work on resiliency, and I just want to shout out to Tui right now because she is a Metro's consultant. So your professor is Metro's consultant right now on this project. And we are working on emergency transportation routes, preparing for, frankly, the impacts of climate change or some of the effects that could happen. And I just did a kind of a cut and paste from our fact sheet, but I encourage you to go to the website if you're interested in this. It's called RETR, and it's a huge amount of work that takes a lot of input from emergency responders, as well as technical information from things like LIDAR. And it's important work, and we'll be wrapping up this year and have official transportation routes throughout the region, thanks to Metro and the work of our consultant, Tui. Next slide. So we've seen some successes. Definitely Art hit on this. The mode shifts have happened in our region over time. Since 2000, non-driving modes have absorbed nearly half of the new commuting trips in the region. But we'll keep going with that. So we have seen a mode shift over time. Next slide. Region-wide. We also, for the Greatland Portland area, these dots represent other MPOs. Portland has kind of an outside status in terms of drive alone commuting. You know, we are in the likes of Boston and Chicago in terms of low rates of bike alone commuting, as well as commuting by transit. We're ahead of a lot of other regions, and we consider that a success. Next slide. Another success we've seen is we've seen density form near transit. So as part of our growth 2040 growth concept, we envision growth really to happen around our light rail lines. And we're working on also having that strategy around bus rapid transit. But we saw that come to life when a great example of that is the Ornico Town Center in Hillsborough that is right along a light rail line. And I think TriMet may hit on that a little bit later. So I'll keep going, but we consider that a success of our growth plan. Next slide. So where have we not been successful? It lands us on affordable housing. And I think there's some unintended consequences from some, and I won't say all from the planning work that was done in the 70s, but I think no one could have, I don't know if no one could have foreseen, but it certainly wasn't foreseen at the rate of which people were moving here and the amount of growth that we would have had. And that's why I wanted to point out that really that doubling from 1 million to 2 million. One of the results of that was a massive shortage of affordable housing. And here's a picture that shows the needed housing compared to the available housing. And you can see in almost every county in the metro area that the need is twice as much as the available. Next slide. Also, we've seen, gap in ability to pay rent. 2 out of 5 households in the Greatland Portland area rent their homes, and the average rent has gone up 52% in the past 5 years. So we as a region, not just Portland, have become an unaffordable place. Next slide. And then affordable for whom? I think this is really is important that we are also seeing that Black and Native American households are not gaining in terms of median household income. So the blue shows the past 5 years, that's 2011, the green shows gains in income in 2016. You could see that there's almost no gains in Black and Native American people. That means that when those rents go up, who does it impact the most? Clearly Native American and Black people in the Portland region. Next slide. We've also seen the negative impacts of gentrification. And oh man, this quote is Tamika Butler's, and it somehow came off the slide. So I'll read it, and I just want everybody to know Tamika said this. I actually wrote it down when she came and did a presentation at Metro because I thought it was so well done. But she said, we have to recognize that when white people come into our spaces with their craft beer and their record players and their bikes, all of a sudden the way we're treated in our own communities is different, because the reality is we're perfectly segregated to the other side of town. But now that you can't afford your side of the town and you want to be on our side of the town, now we're an inconvenience. I get choked up every time I read that. So anyway, next slide. So really, you know, what we saw is a massive, you know, the roots of urban planning are racist. And, you know, Art hit on this. And I think all of us, all urban planners, all transportation planners really need to continue to work on what does it mean to reverse the history of racist planning. And this really, I think many of you are familiar with Albina Vision. This shows the history of Albina Vision and the construction of I-5. Metro is currently working closely with Albina Vision right now on their Albina Vision plan. We provided them a $236,000 grant to get it off. But really this shows some of the impacts of I-5. Next slide. I get a chance to recover because I get choked up. So what are we doing about it? We're trying. So the first thing it is to come up with an equity strategy and equity plan. So we have an equity plan that CORE helped develop for the whole agency, as well as a department specific plan. And we focused on community stability for people of color, focus outreach and engagement, and prioritize projects. All of our grant programs, we set a goal that every grant program that we have has a criteria and a requirement for projects that benefit people of color, people with limited English proficiency, low income, and youth and seniors. Next slide. We also did a lot of outreach on the last community priorities, and we heard from the community what was some of their challenges. And in addition to affordable housing, which we also heard a lot about traffic safety and access to jobs, as well as public health. Next slide. So some of the new investments, some of the new things that we're doing is really, first, Metro is in the housing business. And in 2018, we developed kind of a housing framework in 16 and 17. And then we put to ballot to the voters to invest in affordable housing, and they passed it. The largest affordable housing measure, not only in Oregon, but one of the largest in the nation. Oops. The other thing, just to say, is that the important thing is closely following that, Metro also passed a supportive, or the voters passed, but Metro is implementing a supportive housing services. The supporting housing services is really important because that helps pay for rent assistance, that helps pay for a lot of things that keep people in place, like drug assistance, those types of things. So these two programs are now married together, being implemented by Metro. Next slide. Okay, sorry, my timing's off, yeah. Okay, the other thing that we are working on is we're actually we created a community stability group to work on anti-displacement programs and policies. The first pilot of that is the Southwest Corridor Equitable Development Strategy. I think Bob is going to talk about Southwest Corridor, but we brought people together who live along that corridor who would be impacted by the light rail well in advance of the light rail going in. And actually the community members developed these criteria, and this is what we do. We have a $2 million grant from FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, and we identify sites to preserve, we locate affordable housing, we work with local banks to make sure that local businesses can stay in place. And it's been a hugely successful program so far that we hope to expand for other light rail lines. Next slide. And then last, I mentioned traffic analysis. This is what in our RTP, where we have concentrations and overlap of people of color, limited English, and low income. Next slide. If you overlap that with traffic safety, which is something that we heard is a huge concern in our public outreach, you'll see a high overlap between people of color and where the fatal and serious injuries are happening. And so we've made the high injury corridors priorities for investments. Next slide. And that's just another way to look at it. Wow. Okay, those two slides are very duplicative, so keep going. We have a lot of good mappers at ODOT, or at, I'm sorry, at Metro. I said ODOT. So I mentioned that the Regional Transportation Plan has both policies and projects. In the 2018 RTP, we identified the need, we collectively in the region, for over $42 billion of projects that need to be built. So that gives you a snapshot of the need. This is actually an interactive map that if you want to go onto and click on, it's super fun. I recommend getting a drink and just enjoying it. Not that I've done that myself. Next slide. So much to click on. It's endless. And we don't have enough money to do what we need to do. This is a slide that shows what it would take to get to all the walking and biking needs at the current investment, at the current rate of investment of federal dollars, not including anything new that's maybe proposed. And you could see that at our current rate, it would take us to 2252 to match, to meet all of our needs for biking and walking in the region. Next slide. And also, Oregon has a fewer sources to pay for transportation than other people. So I like this slide a lot because it's kind of creates an aha moment. If you look at the blue, that's state gas tax raised by our friends in the states, in the western states. And then you see the green, which is title and registration fees, which is pretty similar. And then you look at vehicle sales, and that's really, sales tax, right? And look at how far that puts Oregon behind. And really in California and Washington, and particularly in California, most of the MPOs get that money on sales tax and we're able to use it for regional initiatives. Okay, next slide. How I'm doing on time, Tui? I'm good? I'm just about to wrap up.
No, you're actually perfect on time. You still have another 5 minutes. I don't know how you were able to make such great headway.
I'm a fast talker. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more. So here's my disclaimer. As an employee of Metro, I cannot opine on the transportation measure. This means I cannot tell you to support or not to support the transportation measure. I cannot infer that you should support or not support the transportation measure. So I am going to do my best to stick to the facts to talk about the proposed measure 26-218 that's on the ballot. So what is it? It's a proposed transit, traffic, and transportation and programs package in Multnomah County, Washington County, and Clackamas County. We met for 22 meetings with the task force with representatives from all over the region. It was 1/3 nonprofit, 1/3 elected official, and 1/3 business. And we took our time, and the actual task force identified all of the projects, first the corridors, then the projects, then the programs in the package. Next slide. You will see if you go to our website, if you go to the Get Moving website, you'll see resolutions that have passed. And if you really want to geek out on this, there is a whole resolution for a loan. This is the corridor resolution. And that's where all this information on projects is. And then there's a resolution on programs, and there's a description of that. And then there's kind of an administrative resolution. That's the work plan of how it would be implemented. And so I'm going to give just a high overview, but if you're really interested in this topic, there's a lot of things there on the website. So There's 17 primary corridors. You can see they spread across the region. Many of these corridors were identified as high crash corridors. They also carry large amount of transit. So the two highest transit ridership in the region are 82nd and TV Highway. They are also the two highest of our crashes in the region, interestingly. Oops, can you stay on that slide? The proposed tax is on certain employers, 0.75 of payroll. Again, there's a proposed independent oversight committee to review it once it's passed, and the tax would not be assessed. If the tax, so this is the disclaimer that Secretary of State wants us to say, so I'm trying to get this right. If it's not passed, we're not going to implement it, basically. And then go to the next slide. We did an equity analysis for this measure. For every single corridor, we looked at who lives on it and what would be the investments that we made. So this is just one example. If you'd like to go onto our website, you'll get a deep dive into each corridor. So you can see that TV Highway, well, there's 181,000 over people who live there. There's 71,000 people of color from all different backgrounds. So that's the top. And then in the bottom, it talks about what we would do on TV Highway. We would do 9 to 17 miles of sidewalks, between 29 and 49 safe cross markings. It depends on what transit design we go through. A lot of bikeway improvements, a ton of street lights, you guys, a ton, 600 to 1,000. We heard over and over again from our outreach that people wanted more street lights. And then a lot of new transit priority signals, as well as 2 to 4 miles of dedicated bus lane on TV Highway. So this is just one example. You know, if you're not familiar with Washington County, Aloha is incredibly diverse. In fact, Aloha has the most diversity in the region, more so in terms of number of languages than say anywhere in Portland. So TV Highway reminds me a lot of Powell in terms of its existing infrastructure. Next slide. Oh, well, I guess I'm at the end on the questions. So I'm slightly ahead of time, and I'll hand it over to Bob, and then we can do Q&A at the end.
Perfect timing, Margie. Perfect timing. Impeccable. Thank you. Thank you. So next up to bat is Bob. He looks like he's ready to take it home. I'll hand it over to you. Malter, if you can bring up Bob's presentation, that's great. Thank you.
Just so while the slides are being pulled up, I'm with TriMet. I'm the agency architect, but I have been with TriMet for over 20 years. And you're going to see similar slides between Margi, Art, and I, which doesn't mean that we're ran out of images and we have to, use each other's. It means that we actually have a shared understanding in the region because we work so closely, and TriMet and Metro go all the way back to our foundings, why we were created for the region. And Art had the same picture, but I overlaid it with this great quote from the urbanist Lewis Mumford, who came to Portland at the behest of some civic leaders who were worried that Portland was getting so full of itself with the Robert Moses idea of building freeways to create pathways for folks to escape out of the inner city blight into the bucolic countryside of the suburbs. And when Mumford came and he said, upon viewing our region, our city, our state, and he threw down the gauntlet. And it was a very strong call out, which really kind of shocked everybody who brought him out here. They didn't expect to be kind of handled so rudely. But basically he said, you've got one of the most beautiful places in the face of the earth, and you're about to just turn it into a toilet. And he was right, which is why Metro, Portland, TriMet, all of us are working so hard to crank back the wheel of a lot of environmental degradation, a lot of social injustice, a lot of wrongs that we created by ourselves in this region. Next slide. And what I think all share, and pioneering, not in terms of a Euro-colonial viewpoint, but the idea of how do we lean into problems, and where do we start to say that, you know, we've got this place and we've got to come up with innovations, and we can't rely upon somebody else to solve the problems for us. And it's this duality. Do we think of this as this sort of place that is a highly spiritual place versus the place that we can extract out all the riches and become wealthy in so doing of that, and then sow the seeds of our own demise? So I think the question, even this summer, emphatically came back right in our face with the wildfires caused by global warming. So it's causing us now, next slide please, to reinvent the institutions of our hopefully our salvation, but it's a process, and it's not something that's fully formed by any means. This is the imperfect, you know, humanity that we're trying to come out of that. But one of the central themes that even today we're seeing is this recognition that, and Margi's slide about, you know, the funding for transportation in the region is a very telling one. You know, we may have this idea of the resources that are limitless, but we know that that's not true. So we recognizing that our power is going to come from when we can come together and create this sort of multiplier effect of when we get together as individuals, there's something magic that happens, and it's bigger than both of us. And it allows us to begin to figure out, well, what do we do, and how are we going to do it, and how do we come together? Next slide, please. And I've seen this happen over my career, and Art too, and Margi also, that we have to collaborate as institutions. We can't just sort of stay in our own lanes institutionally. We have to figure out where is that commonality. I get the fact that we have shared slides speaks to that, that we recognize that when we leverage our agendas together, we can begin to move in ways that any one of us wouldn't be able to do individually. Next slide, please. And as an architect, I believe that the shaping of our physical form comes about through our public interaction, our engagement, and that we actually are, all of us, participating in this sort of shared making, the shaping of what we want. And even, you know, today with the social unrest and pandemic, we're not shying away from that. We're trying to figure out how to do that safely. But my gosh, the fact that we're engaging so strongly is something that's so important to all of us. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Again, you know, we've been speaking about the shared vision. Next slide. That, you know, TriMet is here to deliver on the larger 2040 goals and strategies that are laid out between the centers and corridors. So you're going to see as TriMet that our job, just like Art's at PBOT, is to take the policy and begin to translate it into the physical form. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we've learned in that process is the idea of this contingent relationship, meaning if you do something, I will do something, meaning we have to hold each other accountable, that we just can't do it individually. And that in that holding each other accountable, not in a draconian way, but actually in a very much of a shared values way, you know, more things can begin to happen. So just a few factoids about the system here, next slide. But the takeaway is that we've had to create new tools in this toolbox to reduce those vehicle miles traveled, to reduce, as we were talking about, the impacts of air pollution, the impacts of single occupancy vehicles. Next slide, please. And one of those ways is that as we link together the land use, that throwdown that we talked about of, we are no longer going to be the purveyors of sprawl. We are going to be the inventors of a livable density, and we're going to connect it with a multiplicity of transportation forms. Here's at the Aranco station, out in Washington County. I worked on the project in the 90s, and I can remember that these were green fields. These were going through areas that had not yet been developed. And then the filling in over time has happened by design, by policy, by our programs. Next slide, please. And again, next slide. We already talked about this, that we all have, we're operating from a similar playbook. And what we're recognizing is that in this diagram here, that when all you have is the only tool in your toolbox is a car, it's the analogy is if all you have is a hammer, then every problem is a nail. And what we're saying is no, there's many different ways to approach these problems. And as Art was articulating, the tools and the techniques and the way we implement them and the way we figure out how do they relate to one another allows us to get to greater adaptation and use that directly affect the livability of our neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So are we looking towards a sort of utopian, beautiful Jetsons kind of world where everything just moves seamlessly through and we rely upon technology and we have the wonderful nuclear family? That was kind of the imagery back in the 60s, that somehow this is magically going to unfold, in a kind of Disneyland way. But what we're learning is that human beings, we make big mistakes, and that democracy is very messy, but it's so necessary, small d, not big D, democracy, and that there is this innovation. No, go ahead, the next slide. So things are now happening. What was talked about with the one thing we haven't gotten to are the jetpacks, but I'm sure Art's going to figure that one out for me. But as an agency, we're recognizing that we're not just a bus company. We're not just moving people around. We're really here to deliver the land use form. We're really here to deliver the way that folks can move through the system. And we've had to create new pathways to that. It's hard. It takes money. It takes process. It takes input. It takes choices being made. Next slide, please. But one of the things that I'm particularly intrigued about is how we're seeing these translations of our policies and our programs and our strategies beginning to impact and beginning to respond. Next slide. And again, Art and Margi and I, we have this similar, this is the one to look at in East County, where we recognize that where there was, remember that heat map that Art had, but where it was getting cool was out in East County. Next slide, please. So we're embedding in our own business plan this emphasis because that's what our writers tell us that they want. We need more service. The question will be asked, I'm sure, in the chat, why haven't you created a free fare system across the region? Well, that conversation has been going on and will continue to go on. But right now, the thing that we've been hearing, even in the pandemic, how do we plan for greater access to transit? Next slide, please. And so this is looking at the east side of Portland and looking at the roadways, Arch roadways, and Metro's regional systems with TriMet's service delivery. How do we begin to manipulate and change the service? Next slide, please. On things that are not fixed route. And one of that led to this recognition that there needed to be not just service on a bus at the municipal level, but also be able to connect across the region. Next slide, please. Which led to the Division Transit Project, which will come up in a couple of slides. But looking at, is that the right tool? Is the bus the only tool, or is there another tool in our toolbox that we should begin looking at too? And what we've heard from folks over and over again is, can we get to cleaner mobility? And so you'll see a little bit later on that we have accepted that challenge. And even in spite of the pandemic, we're still committed to doing that. Next slide. So the Division Transit Project was one of those outgrowths of trying to invent a new tool. And this is as it will go into downtown Portland over the Tillicum Crossing Bridge and then up Division. Next slide. And it was a result of, again, a Metro-led process of looking and working with Multnomah County, with Gresham, with Portland, East Portland, and coming up with where is that alignment going to be most impactful. Next slide. And there's that great picture of Gene Seneschal Biggs leaning in, former PBOT employee, now over in Beaverton. I think we just sort of move around to different teams. You get traded, waived, you're a free agent. But anyhow, the point is that this came through again with this idea of engagement, very at a micro level, thinking about the macro, but understanding things at that neighborhood level, at that very personal level with the businesses and the folks who were really impacted by the potential for transportation options and new innovations. Next slide. And next slide. So this is thinking about Division as a corridor, and then we as designers for TriMet, figuring out how can we have new amenities that would still be inviting, safe, secure, all those attributes that are really important for folks who want to use the system, but do they feel comfortable doing that? And I've come to learn as an architect, very humbly, that it's not my view point that matters, it's what people's perceptions are, because that perception is the reality that they live with on a daily basis. So here, this is at Ava Jeans on Division, recognizing that that's a business that's right next to a transit stop. So can these things actually reinforce each other and actually work together without compromising the performance of either one? That's a very difficult proposition, and yet that's the game, that's the challenge we are facing. Next slide. And we want to meet that challenge. So as we queue up thinking about Southwest Corridor, again, building out the regional system, going down Barber, again, the former state highway, auto-centric, the land use patterns along there are anything but urban. And yet the disconnectedness of those neighborhoods, and as you saw in some of the earlier mapping, this is an area that it's not just about a line going down Barber, it's about all the things that connect into it. And it's not just sidewalks, it's not just bike lanes, it's also habitat restorations, it's also about stormwater, it's about the values that are important for folks in this corridor. Next slide. So that process of engagement, that process of meeting people out on the street and in their neighborhoods and talking and walking and listening to what is important. So I was just on an hour-and-a-half long meeting today with the Southwest Corridor Equity Coalition. And this is about bringing, small institutions, nonprofits, who have specific needs and interests, and yet by coming together, that idea collectively, what we can talk about, this is what's already happening in this corridor, far earlier than anything else we've ever done, partially of a recognition of where we have failed, mostly a recognition of what we want to aspire to become and how we can do that together collectively. Next slide. We learned a lot of things on the Orange Line. We did a lot of things right for that as a project. We faced enormous challenges and some very strident opposition. But on the Southwest Corridor, and there is a measure Metro has put on the ballot, which we hope will provide the local funding match for that. But nevertheless, the work is still going forward and finding ways to authentically communicate with folks where they understand and what they are thinking about. Next slide. So I've already talked about, next slide. It's all that, but wait, there's still more to come. Building upon the sort of platform of what we can do to address our issues. We know there's a globe out there at a huge scale, but Lewis Mumford told us we got to address these issues here, and we're doing that. Next slide. City of Portland, Metro, TriMet came together to appeal to this large grant opportunity to create the sort of consortium of ways to connect across the region. Next slide. And while we didn't get the big prize from the Allen Foundation. Just the fact that we worked together and identified what our options and opportunities were was hugely important. It also led for last year, the City of Portland and PGE and TriMet to finally recognize, folks, we got to do this thing, and we can't wait for some sort of thing to come to us. We got to lead into it. And so here's the 8 things that we as an agency committed to last fall in cooperation with our partners at Metro in the city and PGE, one of our large utility provider. Now, the pandemic and everything else that's hit us has really kind of put us on a funding hit. But this is still the vision that we want to go to, that we are going to go to an all-electric system. In last year's class, the gauntlet was thrown down by several of the students. Why haven't you done this? Why are you delaying this adaptation? Well, we want to do that. And part of the funding measure would also extend the benefits to get youth all across the region be able to use the transit system. Next slide. And then something hit the fan. We, like everybody else across the country, just majorly hit. We still put out service in spite of the pandemic. Our ridership plummeted. We're looking at a funding challenge, the likes of which you've never seen over the next several years. Well, please help us with, help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi, help us. So we're committed to those big goals and objectives, but it's going to get kind of dicey real quick, and things will get real very soon. Next slide. But future is coming. Things are going to be happening. Disruptive technologies, as Art mentioned, these are going to be huge game changers, and you guys are going to be right in the midst of it. Next slide. We sense that these things are happening. Are they fait accompli? No, but we're mindful that out on the horizon are things that are going to be transformative. Next slide. All right, 1 minute.
Good timing. That's perfect. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. You took it home. So let's break. We are actually making really good time. So let's break for 10 minutes and think of some really, really intelligent questions you can ask ask them, or each of them. So we'll come back at 8:10, and we have a good 20 minutes for Q&A. So I hope you're thinking of questions. Also think about your project, and we'll return. Thank you so much. See you in a bit. And we received a couple of good questions in the chat that came in during your talk. So let me read them, because they've been kind of on hold in the chat room for a while. So the first, let me make sure I get the first one, but I want to address those first, if that's okay, just because they were brought up first. And this goes first to Art from Phil. How does PBOT think about and include homeless populations in strategy and planning if streets are for everyone? How do you prioritize those needs versus other transportation needs?
It's not the part of PBOT that I'm as actively involved in, but there has been a lot of deliberation by the city around sidewalk usage, and a lot of debate with city council around the ability for people to stay on the streets overnight, but not during the day, those kind of elements. So that's one level. It's not a very, I guess, probably proactive level of interaction. We don't have a lot of, I guess, maybe it's worth a clarifying question from Phil, or is it, we don't have a lot of active engagement with the homeless community around their desire to continue to live on the streets. I guess if that's the question, there isn't a lot of active programming there, though there's a lot of partnership with the Joint Homelessness Council for putting porta potties and working with them on people's storing of stuff, those kind of elements. But I think, I guess I don't have a very good answer to that. It's a good question.
Sorry, when you're working from home, you get a cat eating things that you should not be eating things. Next question. I think this one also comes from Phil. I'll just read this again. I think it's somewhat different, and I think it came, maybe it was during Art's presentation. It says, it asks, well, does PBOT consider Portland residents their customer or ratepayer taxpayer? That's really a different bureau. That's kind of a, how do you factor the needs of
I understand where this is going. Yeah.
you factor the needs of commuters from other jurisdictions
Yeah.
who contribute to the city economy but choose to live elsewhere?
Right. I mean, we're working to attend to a transportation system, and so that's a mixture of Portlanders and people who are navigating to and through Portland. But it's an ongoing tension because a lot of the city priorities are focusing on the shorter trip mobility elements. So when you think about sort of the division of labor between us, TriMet, Metro, ODOT, we're focused more on those shorter trips that are within Portland's boundaries, where our partner agencies are focused more on those longer trip mobilities. But both people who live in Portland and people who are traveling to Portland are consumers of that system. So I guess if that's the question.
If I could pick up on that a little bit, Art, because the distinction's important. And again, in the 90s, when I was a consultant to TriMet, I remember bristling when I would ask, you know, are they customers, or are they, you know, we just move people? And the response back then was that this is about mass transit. I said, well, I thought it was about land use and how to achieve land use goals. And finally, when I came to TriMet, there was this internal tension in the agency, and I can tell you now, and it wasn't because of rainbows and puppy dogs and ice cream. It was about some very brutal things that had happened on our system, and we realized that we weren't looking at people as customers, as the experience of transit. And my current general manager, who actually comes from the private sector, he laid it out and he said, if we don't start expecting more from our agency as a provider of services, that people can choose whether or not they're going to use them. Yes, there's folks who are transit dependent, but that shouldn't be something like that's the only, you know, mode that you have access to. You still have choice. And the future is going to be going to those who will be able to provide that service that you want and need. And if you only think of people as a sort of commodity, wave goodbye to your industry, because it's just going to go right out the door. And I've seen, especially in this pandemic, quite frankly, where your choice to get on transit is a matter, being a little hyperbolic, of life or death. You know, you're making that choice. And even our operators have to, you know, deliver in that way. So it got real, and it got real fast. And I think we're going to take one of the lessons from the pandemic is that when you see somebody riding on transit as an agency, you're like, thank God they're using us, you know, and we better, you know, deliver something that is meaningful and impactful and God help us, a pleasant experience. Otherwise, you know, they're going to stay at home and they're going to drive cars, and this whole thing is going to crater. So we've made far too much of an investment to treat it as just a sort of a commodity of use.
Thank you, Bob. That's important. It's important to bring it home and to make it real, because it's a real thing. People still have to travel during this time, and being able to travel safely is very important. And there's a lot to contend with on transit during this period. I have another question for Art. This is from Quincy. Art, I'm wondering if you could talk about how PBOT is looking at ways to engage community members, especially communities of colors and youth. How can PBOT continue to develop relationships with community-based organizations?
Yeah, actually there's a lot to talk about here, so I'll try to be brief, for many years, PBOT as an agency has had partnerships and collaborations with community organizations, but a lot of it has been based on the individual sort of tenacity and interest of project managers or planning staff specifically. So it made for very inconsistent engagement with community organizations. And the more recent work where we are developing sort of deeper and more sort of financial connections to community organizations has really helped to transform that. And I really credit Irene Marion, the equity manager, for working on sort of transforming that relationship. PBOT, so for youth specifically, I have staff within the active transportation department that work specifically on safe routes to school. And so they're working a lot with youth every day in terms of engaging them in the planning practice and in working, with other planning projects and engaging them. So in terms of how can we continue to do that, I think those programmatic efforts that we're doing right now to make that a more sort of consistent systemic approach is probably the most crucial element. One of the challenges is overtaxing those organizations, and that's where I think the resource ability for organizations, community organizations, to receive some funding, so it helps them to maybe increase their staffing level to be able to continue to engage rather than having it be a strain on their overall work program.
I had a quick follow-up question. I guess when I was talking about youth, I didn't just mean like maybe students, but more like young people under the age of 25 that are maybe trying to transition into like transportation professional spaces. How is PBOT kind of training, like attempting to kind of keep young people that are maybe growing up in Portland in the space and actually being involved in the community? Sure.
Some of the continued work that we've been doing on various projects have been a good way for youth to be engaged. We also continue to be active participants in the internship programs that are offered through the city. So we have a set of interns even amidst the pandemic that are a great way for people to be sort of putting their toe in the water in terms of understanding transportation planning or transportation programmatic offerings. So I think that continues to be a good venue as well. And we're constantly running committees to help advise us on specific projects. And like I mentioned, that was my entry as a 23-year-old or whatever it was into the transportation space, was participating in this class and participating in the Tillamook Bikeway way back when. So that's a great, I think, entry into that overall.
So the Tillamook Bikeway, did that turn into the Tillamook
Greenway, yeah.
Greenway.
Yeah. So that was one of the first more formal greenways after Salmon and Taylor. Those were really the first two, and then.
Yeah. Hey Quincy, I want to acknowledge that question. I think it's a really good question, but I think you should hold that for Earl next week because he really wants to.
Yeah. The reason why I ask it, I actually have been working on PBOT's Healthy Businesses Permitting strategy as kind of a community member, and I haven't been getting compensated. So like my question is kind of like, there's been this lack of compensation, I think, particularly with PBOT, that I haven't seen with TriMet and Metro when it comes to working with community members. And so I'm just trying to understand, like, how can there be more of a pathway to like compensate, particularly youth of color as they work with trying to advance equitable spaces.
Yeah, I think hopefully Irene can come join the conversation later on. There's a number of pathways, and so I think that's something that we can talk more with you about it. It is candidly also the way that you get into this space is proving your participation. So, it is not uncommon to start out as a volunteer and then turn yourself into someone who has a level of experience. And so I know that's not a great answer, but there's a lot of people who are using that as a first step into the process.
I understand. I guess the thing I would ask is, like, I actually work with TriMet and Metro, and they do compensate me. So I'm just trying to understand, like, why is there a difference between like the compensation pathways for youth with Metro and TriMet, and maybe not as many pathways for that in PBOT spaces?
Might be the level of funding for the specific programs we're working on. The Healthy Business is not as well funded as a large scale programmatic offering that you might be experiencing in those other spaces. So that could be a piece of it. There's also different policies across those different agencies. Metro and TriMet have a more generous interpretation of that compensation, where the city attorney has advised us to do a more conservative approach. So that's also a piece of the puzzle. For healthy business in particular, that is something that was very much thrown together without a pre-programmed budget. And so it is something that essentially even departments within PBOT are essentially volunteering to help make it happen. So it's
Yeah,
very
I guess
much
I would
coming
just,
together.
I would say, like, you know, as TriMet and Metro and PBOT work together and their initiatives, I think, you know, trying to come up with strategic planning on community engagement strategies would be a very effective way, so that communities know how to effectively engage with city government, TriMet and Metro in an effective way. I think, you know, if we're working on similar projects, working on very similar corridor improvements, having one strategy would be very helpful for community members to know how to effectively engage.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Thanks, Quincy. Thanks for raising that. I think it's really important. I'm going to turn it over to the hand raise function. And Carrie, could you unmute yourself and ask the question, your question?
Sure, but I actually want to validate what Quincy just said. Not that he needs validation, but the lack of compensation is a huge barrier. I would say not just to youth, but to, I'm going to go with moms, you know, people who just want to communicate and want to try to participate in the planning process and just and can't do it without compensation. I mean, clearly youth is one thing, but it's statewide. It's a statewide issue too. Anyway, that was all my question. I just wanted to, I hear you, Quincy, big time on that. My question was more about like regional planning and some of the assumptions that go behind it. I heard Margie mention this, and then Bob, you kept talking about using new tools, but one of the things that I've thought about is a lot, especially when it comes to bus routes, is it seems to be there's a big assumption that people worked in downtown Portland. And I know I personally have been frustrated by trying to commute not to downtown Portland, but some pretty big distances across just the city of Portland, and not wanting to cross the river. And so where do you guys get your data? How often do you refresh your data or reflect on the data, especially when it comes to buses? Because in theory, the beauty of buses is that they can move around. I mean, they can move them.
That's a great question. It's actually related to another question in the chat. So I might do a twofer and answer both at the same time. It's related to the greenhouse gas modeling question. So Metro for a long time has had a travel demand model. TriMet uses it a lot. We're really tied at the hip to TriMet because they don't do their independent modeling. You do some service planning, but it's all plugged into a model, and a lot of other partners in the region. The travel demand model is based, so it's an activity-based model. That's really important. Well, Metro was one of the first in the nation to have an activity-based model, which means it makes assumptions about where people are active and how modes can switch. And so the data sets, the team of modelers are constantly updating the travel demand model. There's some big pushes when census data comes out. That's one big push. So the population data. We all know that census data has its holes. I would say probably the biggest holes are immigration data. But that's a pretty quick turnaround, and we have our hands kind of on where we have good trends on where people are moving and how quickly they're moving from one place to another. One interesting travel demand model that we are wrestling with right now is the travel demands model ability to take in new technologies. And it's playing out in itself with bus rapid transit. So the activity-based model had a long-standing kind of formula that had works and still works for light rail, where if you put a light rail in and there's this much ADT or average daily traffic, you'd assume a mode shift. But when we were trying to model 82nd, we were like, well, what if you take a bus lane that currently doesn't have its own designated lane and turn it into a designated lane and then put signal priorities for transit all along? The model struggled with that because it doesn't know. So we learned that in the past RTP, and this is something that we're working on. In fact, we just had a meeting about it today where our planners are saying, okay, modelers, how are you doing on that, improving the outputs of the bus rapid transit? So it's not perfect. Just like anything else, modeling is assumptions in the future, and it's meant to be a guide. But it's a pretty good guide. It's the best we have to kind of gauge what might happen in the future. But it's certainly an input, and not when decision making, when elected officials, especially at the JPAC table, that's the Joint Policy Advisory Committee on Transportation, the modeling is an input. It's a very important input, but it's not the final decision. And I think stories like yours, Carrie, I think are important as well in terms of what's happening on the ground and what are the needs on the ground. And I don't know, Art, Bob, you guys have both been around our travel demand model for a long time, and how that plays out with transit. So I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tool. It helps us with decision making. It is not the only bit of information that we need, and particularly if you're trying to chart a different course than you've been on. It is a tool that really struggles to chart, to take inputs that don't exist or the achievements that we haven't achieved and build them into it. And so it's helpful as we're comparing alternatives that are, but it is, I think, only that. It's only able to just give us some backdrop, and that there's still a need for us to just understand what are the general right directions we need to be taking the system in. And it's hard to not have all the data and information you want to have.
Well, it's hard to model. It's like the whole nobody rides their bike here, so why would you put a bike lane and then you put a bike lane and people are riding their bike? I mean, it's that.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly it. Yeah.
And frankly, thanks to PBOT's data collection, our model has better bike data than almost NPO, because PBOT has done such a good job over the years of data collection. And there was, actually didn't answer part 2, which was the GHG. I'll just say, from modeling greenhouse gases, we do have a model. It's imperfect. I think we could do better. There are California MPOs that are starting to do better work, but basically we base it on the travel demand model and then use an air quality model moves, and we post-process that to get what we expect on emissions. And so we have a way to gauge it, but it's not, again, it's not perfect, but we do model GHG like for the RTP. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions on that.
That's a good question. And sometimes the predictions are not real.
Well, pulling on that thread a little bit, and this is not answering Carrie your question, but it reminded me of something that when I provided that list of the 8 things we said we're going to do, one of them was this sort of wacky idea that when we thought about it, we thought this would be brilliant. And that is, we send out every day hundreds of these, what could be little data gatherers. They're called buses. And if we could put on them the monitoring to actually pull down the
I'll message Bob on his audio.
Yeah, let's message Bob. I'm gonna mute him or we're gonna lose all our eardrums.
I'm sure his answer was like brilliant, what he was going to talk about. Like, we're so missing this great discussion about buses.
It's very very architectural, very theoretical. Okay, I think you're okay. Good, you sent him a chat. So class ends at 8:40. I think I'm actually going to take one more question and we'll have that one in the class. Who is it? I think everybody should just mute themselves. I think I'm okay, except I just have like animals running around and it's okay. But let me see here. it's up for grabs. Okay, so we have a question from Julie and another one that came in from Steve. But I also have Megan who has her hand up, Mariah, and Josh. So I'm gonna let you, one of you, Margi, why don't you pick?
That's terrible to do.
That's
to me. Okay,
terrible.
who is not? Oh, what a terrible thing. I don't know.
I don't know. I know it's so hard.
Who
This class
hasn't?
needs to be like 3 hours or something. It's
Right, I know. Who hasn't spoken tonight? Maybe Mariah, because I haven't seen. I'm just going to pick a random person that I haven't seen speak tonight. So is that the person I hand up? There you go.
Sounds
I did it, but it was totally random for everybody else in the room. Okay.
okay. Last question of the night.
Okay, my question is for Art, and is about the Safe Streets initiative. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about how that was developed, whether it was developed based on existing plans and just kind of rolled out as the pandemic hit, and it seemed relevant, or if it was developed in response to the pandemic, and if so, what was it like, or what was the process like to develop a program so rapidly?
Sure. No, it's a great question. It wasn't something that had been pre-established. There was sort of ingredients to it of understanding what some of our objectives were in terms of protecting the greenways or making busier streets safer, or some of the existing programs for street seats or business in the right of way. But no, none of those elements happened. And really, it was you lock planners at home in a pandemic and say, come up with what we can do. We're all feeling just so helpless right now, and they, came up with the framework that's in that document, as well as some of the initiatives. And it was really very different than how many of our processes have been, because we didn't have time to do a lot of consultation and long conversations. We just said, here's a couple ways that we think we can be relevant as an agency. Let's try to contribute. And so, but it was hard. The agency as a whole was amidst the true direct line response at that time as well. And so this, at first, it was really hard to gain traction within the organization that this was a way that we could contribute to life more generally over the course of the summer and fall, when we were in such an acute period of direct response kind of activity. Yeah, good question. It was
Since Art answered that so quickly, can I just address, I think it's Julie Hammond's note, because I really want to riff on that. She noted in the chat that she's like, what about the kind of what I would call bread and butter improvements that so many people, I think, tend to get overlooked? This is lighting, sidewalks, benches. This is what we overwhelmingly heard when Metro did outreach for the transportation measure. We had contact with over 9,000 people, and over and over again, it was the little stuff. It was the sidewalk connection. It was the pedestrian light. It was staying warm at the transit center. It was getting a little bit faster somewhere. And I was having a conversation with my brilliant counselor, Counselor Gonzalez, and he said, well, what are all the things we're going to do on 82nd? And I said, Counselor Gonzalez, we can build a hyperloop on 82nd, but people are still going to get killed if we don't do the street lighting. He's like, got it, okay. And I think that's really the backbone of our transportation measure, is we have a lot of those arterials where it's a lot of bread and butter, crosswalks, sidewalks, lighting. But that was just, I was overwhelmed by how much demand there was for, I would say, I think Julie called it the less sexy stuff, but it's the things that make people safe, and it's the thing that makes our streets safer. So I just, I liked that question. So thank you, Julie. See, I got 2 done there.
Yeah, but we also have like maybe 1 minute left if you want to answer it quickly. Since we still have you, Margi, is Steve actually has a question in the chat also that talks about the ballot measure, and if it doesn't pass.
What happens to Southwest Corridor?
Yeah, what happens to Southwest Corridor?
I mean, we're at risk of losing our federal funding, absolutely. And in these situations, so this is not the first time that Metro and TriMet have done a rail line. This is not the first time we've chased federal funds and local funds for it. It's not the first time that we've been unsuccessful and we try again, but we will have a management meeting between TriMet and Metro days after the measure. and decide next steps. But will it significantly delay, postpone the project? Absolutely, no doubt. The project really, really depends on the measure. I think on the optimistic side, there was a ton of really good project development work, not only on Southwest Corridor, but on many bus rapid transit and transit lines. And that project development work does not go away if the measure doesn't pass. We will use that project development work to pursue federal funds and state funds and so on. So we have good foundational blocks there.
Right at 8:40. We did better this time, Michael. I didn't go over 10 minutes. Oh, we didn't go over 10 minutes.
Right.
I really want to close it with saying thank you. It was I believe it was a good night. I hope it was for everyone. It was. I hope it was a shared experience for the students as well as the guest speakers, just to come together and be together to talk about these issues. And how relevant and how important and how timely it all is. Any last words from anybody? We should close pretty soon. I know we have an ongoing chat in the Slack channel. If you guys have any questions, you can always email me as well. But we talked about the project, the scavenger hunt, everything else. So I'm gonna sign off pretty soon unless anybody has some dire questions for us to be on. But I just want to say thank you for a really wonderful, well-spent evening. Art, Margie, and Bob, and everyone.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well played, Bob. Well played.
Yeah.
8:41.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What?
Have a
Take
great week,
care.
everyone.
Take care, Art. Take care, Margie.
Bye-bye.